And boy, that's a great song to sing on the first Sunday of 2013. And I think that's really what this is about, is adoring Him. Hope you had a good holiday season. I'm Pastor Joey, and I usually work here, but haven't been working here for the last couple of weeks. And to be honest with you, I have felt so out of sync for the last 2 weeks. It's just crazy. Yeah, thank you. It's nice to be home. And I really miss my church family. I've been kind of played the part of a pagan for the last couple of weeks and haven't gone to church. And so I think pastors need to do that every now and then just as a reality check. It's like, you know what? There's absolutely nothing better to do than be in church on Sunday mornings. Amen? This is where you want to be. And that's something that sometimes I have to prove to myself, and you do too. And you've been in that situation before. I really appreciate and am thankful for those who spoke. Paul, I understand, did a great job, and Nate did a great job. So I really appreciate the guest speakers, and I'm really appreciative of the fact that we have some internal guest speakers that can step up and do a great job. And so I'm really thankful for that. I'm also thankful for the cards and things that you've given, not only related to the holiday season, but also related to the death in Donette's family. I was here on December 16th. Right after that service, I loaded up the car and headed west to Quincy, Illinois. And we spent a bulk of our time there. And I was like, one prayer I had, because Donette's dad has been ill, and he had been ill for a few days before I actually got there. And Donette was able to go a couple of days earlier than me. And so she had a little more sustained, I guess you could say, quality time with her dad. And then I was able to kind of come as a second phase from Indiana and Nelson Clan. And my prayer was, God, let me get there before he passes, because I wanted to be there and say goodbye. And I also wanted to be there with the family as I processed through it. And not really knowing how it was going to go when I left here after church on Sunday the 16th. But I did make it 8:15 p.m., and he died at 8:35 p.m. So I had 15 minutes there to say goodbye. So I'm really thankful for that. But it's been quite a journey, and this has not been a normal Christmas this year. And I just kind of had a feeling. I've kind of been saying stuff regarding that here a couple weeks before I left, and I just kind of had a feeling it wasn't going to be a normal Christmas. And boy, that's right. And it's not just me, though. It's many of you. I mean, I know that your stories, we all have different stories, and many of you have had some very interesting things happen in your lives this year, and it's not been a normal Christmas. So our prayers and thoughts are with you as you work through some of these things. But it is good to be home, and it's good to be with you. I've thought a lot about you and a lot about this series, and we will continue to work our way through this series, The Spiritual Dark Ages, A Hero Must Rise. And that's what we've been dealing with for the last several weeks, since about October. And we're in Judges chapter 4 today, and that's going to make for a very interesting message. In fact, it's a very interesting first Sunday of the year message. It's dramatic narrative at its finest, but it is very, very interesting. It's very powerful. It's very surprising how this goes, but it picks right up with the trend we've seen here in the book of Judges. And when we have a title like The Spiritual Dark Ages, A Hero Must Rise, the implication is that there is such a thing as evil in the world. The spiritual dark ages. Well, what makes them dark? You and I do. And that's our issue. You see, we're caught in a mess down here. Unless God intervenes in our world, and unless God intervenes in our hearts, this thing stays dark. But the beauty is that he has intervened. He refuses to let go of a fallen planet. He hangs on to it in Jesus. And we see in Jesus that everything changes. In fact, he is the ultimate hero that rises up in the spiritual dark ages to give deliverance to a people otherwise oppressed, under bondage, much of which is of their own doing, like you and I. We behave ourselves into bondage. And then we have to call out to the Lord for deliverance, and God so graciously comes through for us so many times. And ultimately, though, he came through for us in Jesus. And so there is such a thing as evil. It has a big part in the spiritual dark ages. And the presence of evil, the power of evil tried to destroy the nation of Israel many, many centuries ago. The power of evil tried to destroy the promised one that would come through them and set all of us free. The power of spiritual darkness has endeavored to thwart the plans that God has for the church. And without the book of Judges and some of the things that happen in this book, we would not have Old Testament prophets. For many of them chronologically came after the period of the Judges. We would not have much, in fact, everything post-Mosaic, we would not have. Because if it were not for a sovereign God that worked and ruled in an otherwise spiritually dark world, known as the spiritual dark ages, the book of Judges, we would not have an Old Testament. Like I said, post-Mosaic, we would have the first 5 books of the Bible, but we would not have an Old Testament. After that, we would not have Christmas. We would not have the life of Jesus. We would not have Easter. We would not have the church. We would not have Apostle Paul. We would not have John the Revelator. We would be missing so much were it not for the sovereign God who works through many various details and works through the heroic actions, not always actions that you and I can fully endorse, but He works through actions of heroes, people who amount to be heroes and heroines, or we could say sheroes. We've got heroes and sheroes, and today we look at a shero, a couple of sheroes. Were it not for their actions. Now again, we can't always endorse all that they've done. But what we have to conclude is that God works through flawed leaders to sovereignly accomplish His purpose, even through very, very graphic and explicit assassination stories. Unless you see what God is doing in the big picture, you come away with the scratching your head and wondering what in the world is going on in the book of Judges. Well, the book of Judges shows us what happens when we do what's right in our own eyes. And so that's what we're looking at here today, is a very interesting shero story. In fact, of all the judges that are talked about, in fact, all of them are men, but today we have a team of judges or a team of leaders, the primary one of which is called Deborah, and her name means bee or honeybee. And she is the one female judge, prominent female judge, that God used to start to cycle out of their disobedience, to cycle out of their spiritual darkness into a new day. Okay? And so what we see is that God raises up even flawed leaders sovereignly to accomplish His purpose. Again, from about 1300 BC to 1000 BC, were it not for these heroes or sheroes, then we wouldn't have the people of Israel, okay? And I think I've made this clear. But God shows His faithfulness to preserve them because there are promises given of a Savior who would eventually come, a promised one who would come and who would set humanity free, who would break into our spiritual dark age, rise up in one heroic act, and deliver all of us. And that, in fact, is what He was able to do. But His faithfulness, the promise of a coming one, streams and threads its way down through Old Testament history. And eventually, God breaks into our world. The Old Testament closes with Malachi saying, watch out for Elijah, he's going to come. And so, in other words, the Old Testament revelation wasn't done. There was more to come. He said, and so get ready for it. And finally, Elijah comes, and John the Baptist, he says, here's the king, and the king arrives. And we have never been the same. So that's an incredible storyline. But we have to go back to the headwaters. the headwaters of the story, and we go back and we work our way back to the beginnings of the story of the nation and the promises given to this nation. And so many of them, you look at this story and you're thinking, how in the world did God's story make it through all that carnage and mess? But He did. And He uses these heroes and sheroes, these flawed leaders, to bring about a great and mighty deliverance and a preservation of His people, thus preserving the future story of redemption for all of us. On slide number 2 on the screen, you're going to see it's a time when there was little or no government, there was no king. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And I think it's a very fitting description of the ideology in the world, secular worldview of our time. This is how we live life. Slide number 4, jumping right into the text. Judges 4, chapter 4, verses 1 through 24. And we have been through 3 cycles. We talked about Othniel, okay, the mighty military hero. We've talked about Ehud, who took on the overweight Canaanite king and defeated him. We've talked about Shamgar. Somebody ought to name your son Shamgar. That would be an interesting name, wouldn't it? Well, it'd be a biblical name. Shamgar. We talked about him, the one verse hero that he just did all that he could do. He used an ox goad to accomplish a great deliverance and preservation of the nation of Israel. And then now we're in the 4th cycle of a 7-cycled process that is laid out for us in the book of Judges. And so you know the pattern. You know how this goes. It cycles down through disobedience. They cry out to God. They repent. They cry out. God delivers. He raises up a judge, a shero or a hero to deliver them, and they cycle back to a period of peace. But verse 1 tells us, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord now that Ehud was dead. And so we know the pattern. And again, the hero drops off the scene, and then the people, they begin to stray, and again, they do evil in the eyes of the Lord. And how many times have we gone there in our stories? Again, the spiritual dark ages is not just something out there, it's in here. And how many times have we again done evil in the eyes of the Lord? It's our story. I could probably just preach on that today. Again, they did evil. How many times do we have to cycle through this stuff? How many times do we have to endure the consequences of decisions made before we cry out to God in a way that sets our life on a new course? When will we learn? And you have to believe me when I say that sin enslaves us and it takes you further than you want to go. It keeps you longer than you want to stay. It costs you far more than you want to pay. And we've seen that so many times in this book, and we've also seen it in our own lives. Let's hasten on. It's a huge story, 24 verses worth. So let's keep moving. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, king of a Canaanite alliance of nations. City-states or nation-states. And he was the king of this alliance and he reigned in Hatzor, and he had a guy that commanded his armies. His name was Sisera, and he was based in Harosheth Hagoyim, or we could say the woodlands of the Gentiles. And if we look on slide number 28 on the screen, you're going to see on slide 28 how this battle lays out. You know, it's something interesting. You hear me talk a lot about battles in the book of Judges. You can tell a male guy wrote the book, can't you? I mean, he's all about the battles, right? All about the military stuff. So we know just by that implication, probably it was written by a man, right? Because men, you typically love these stories of battle. In fact, I would say this. You know how when I did the series of sermons on the book of Revelation, remember how this front row was lined with 14 and 15-year-old boys and some girls? Remember that? I was like, whoa. I had no idea the book of Revelation would impact them this way. Do you know what's happening in the book of Judges? Young men are coming up to me after church and saying, I never heard this stuff. We love this stuff. Wow. We've got some fight in us. We want to make sure we channel it right. And there's something here, men and women. There's something here, especially for our young men who are looking for a battle to fight, a God to love, a woman to love, and a job to do. And that's what we're being called to do in this book. It's not necessarily go out and assassinate someone, but it is a call for men to rise up and lead. And young men in this congregation are sensing that. They're feeling that. And I'm getting this feedback from them. It's like, yes, this is what we need, being challenged to lead. It's where we all need to be when it comes to this idea of living life in the dark ages. Well, what we've got here is this incredible battle that lays out here in this dramatic narrative. And we're being introduced right away to a couple of guys, Jabin, the king of Canaan, and Sisera, the commander of his armies. And these guys were bad dudes. And I've kind of laid out for you what the Canaanites were like. And boy, they have lived up to the name. We'll look at this in a little more detail in a moment. But Hatzor was located 10 miles north of Lake Hula. It was Lake Hula in the Old Testament Judges time period. It later became known as the Sea of Galilee, or Lake Gennesaret. And it is Hatzor, at the very top of the map, you're going to see where these guys were located. The Jabin, king of the Canaanites, reigned from this city. And Sisera, the commander of the army, reigned from the west. And you'll see, or at least that's where his military headquarters were, Harosheth Hagoyim, woodlands of the Gentiles. Okay, and what you're going to find here in the story is that this is, and I've actually seen this is a big, wide open valley, and it's in fact the place, Megiddo, Armageddon. It's where Armageddon's going to eventually break out. When World War III goes down, that'll be one of the staging centers for that. Okay, and so I've actually seen that. It's the ideal battlefield. All these military guys that's written on that will tell you it's the ideal battlefield for that purpose. But what we have here is the Canaanites are ruling and oppressing the Lord's people. All right? And these are the locations of where these guys have located their forces of operation. So you have the king of the Canaanites in Hatzor. You have his military general to the northwest of the Esdraelon Valley, or Megiddo, we could say, in Harosheth Hagoyim, and they are oppressing the people of the Lord. Okay? Verse 3, because, back to the scripture slide. Thank you. Because who had 900 chariots fitted with iron? It was Sisera, the military general of the Canaanite alliance. He had 900 chariots fitted with iron. And it's just one division because it obviously did not include the foot soldiers. They're just naming the most formidable weaponry that they had to work with was these iron chariots. And again, the Israelis were several decades behind the development of in the Iron Age of these Canaanites and Philistines and Moabites and others who had access to these iron weapons. Okay, these were 900 chariots fitted with iron. And guess what else? They had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. They cried out to the Lord for help. How long will it take us? How long will it take us to realize that our worldview, our center for living, our purpose for life, it cannot revolve around what it's revolved around in the past? Because it's not working. Families are falling apart. Government is falling apart. The church has been reduced to irrelevancy. How long will it take us to cry out to the Lord for help? And what we're going to find here a little later is that Deborah, whom we're going to read about in the next verse, she describes the tyranny inflicted by the Canaanites in her song in Judges 5. And so today I'm going to deal with the story, and next week I'm going to deal with the song that was written as a follow-up to the story. So it's really a two-part deal. Next week, Judges 5, deal with the song. If you want to read it, go ahead and read it in advance this week. Very powerful song of victory that she gets to sing. But these Canaanites, these Jabins and Siseras had a stranglehold on the economy by blocking the major trade routes. In Judges 5:6, we read this. In fact, go to slide number 12 And you'll see this, it comes out in the song of Deborah. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Yael, the highways were abandoned. Travelers took to winding paths because it wasn't safe to travel in the normal roads that they had. And also this was a means of controlling the economy. And they also confiscated the weapons, and they attacked the Israelites when they were defenseless. And you'll see in verse 8 that God chose new leaders, and war came to the city gates, but not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. They had confiscated all the weapons. They didn't have anything to fight with. And then if you'll go to verse 30, I'm not sure what slide number it is, but if you'll go to verse 30, maybe it's slide 20, perhaps, I don't know. Verse 30 of Judges 5, what you're going to find is, and this is Sisera's mother. Sisera doesn't come home from the battle. You're going to see why in just a second. But his mom is waiting for him to come home. And she's trying to come up with all these different reasons why he's delayed in returning home. And so she's like, what could it be? Are they not finding and dividing the spoils? Maybe the plunder is so plentiful. Excuse me. I got a tickle in my throat. Pray for me. Okay? Maybe they're dividing the spoils. And then she writes about a woman or two for each man. So you got to realize how awful this was. These Canaanites would kidnap these Hebrew ladies, young ladies, these Israelis, and they would take them, and they were like part of the war booty, okay, part of the plundering, and they would enslave these Jewish women, these Hebrew women, Israeli women, and she's like, well, maybe there's so many women, maybe in fact there's so many women that each soldier's going to get 2 of them. Instead of just 1 this time. Do you see the oppression of the Canaanites? Do you understand how 20 years of this, 20 years of having your daughters snatched away by an enemy? Now I'm setting you up, okay? I'm helping you see the stuff you're going to read in just a second. You're going to be like, whoa, I can't believe that's in the Bible. Well, I can't believe this is in the Bible. Where the Lord's people, Yahweh worshipers, their daughters are being stolen, their spoils, their clothing's being confiscated, their weapons being confiscated, and Sisera's mother, who wondered why he's not showing up after the battle, she's looking forward to colorful garments, highly embroidered garments for my neck, and all this plunder. I mean, they didn't have shopping malls on Coleraine or on Coliseum. Colerane's where I used to live. It's a mental block. That's actually in Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio. Coliseum in Fort Wayne. She couldn't just walk down the mall and go to this store and that store and pick these things out. No. What they did, you go fight us a battle. Bring back what you can find. It's like shopping day. It's a big day. They look forward to this so much. 2, I might get not 1 woman, but 2, all these garments, all these jewels. Wow! 20 years. The Israelites watched this process. 20 years. And God says, enough. Verse 4. And he raises up a honeybee. Deborah is her name. Deborah. Verse 4, back to the passage. She was a prophet, the wife of Lapidot, which means torches or lights. She was leading Israel at that time. She was graceful like a bee, yet she was fiery and alive as a prophetess. She was a spiritual leader. She was a family leader. We see later in the song of Deborah in Judges 5 that she wrote music as well. So she was a poet, a songwriter, and she says in that song she was a mother of Israel. And so she was a family leader. She was a national leader. She ended up being a military leader in an age of little or no government. But there's also a problem. Where are the men? Why are the men not leading? We don't denigrate the contribution of a Deborah. We need a Shiro. And God sovereignly uses a Shiro. But why, pray tell, is a woman expected to lead the nation of Israel into battle of all things? Where are the men? When we do what is right in our own eyes, men become more feminine, feminine become more masculine. We lose all sense of who we are. Are we not seeing it in the dark ages? Are you not seeing it when you watch TV and you watch TV over the holidays? Are you not seeing that? Why are the men not leading? Why have they lost their identity? You see, this is the beginning of a downward trend, and I can't unpack it for you this morning, but I will be demonstrating in upcoming messages showing you how women are reduced more and more and more in the book of Judges. Now, Deborah is a Shiro, and she has many I have no problems with Deborah. I have no problems with what God is doing in her life. I have no problems with how she was raised up by God to do an incredible work. But what I have an issue with is how, from this point forward, not only are the women being pushed forward having to fight, you're going to see some really strange things done to women in the book of Judges. It's what happens when we do what's right in our own eyes. Hold that thought. Don't miss a Sunday, because I'll unpack it as we go. Not now. Let's move on. We have a story to work through. Verse 5. Deborah held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. What's being stated? There's no central government to legal system to work these things out. Deborah was a woman of wisdom, a woman of respect, a prophet, and so she became, for all intents and purposes, a form of a makeshift government in a very spiritually dark age. In fact, the Hebrew word translated held court was used to describe the way in which a magistrate would settle disputes. And this was very important at a time when the infrastructure of the nation had broken down. There's no normal channels of justice to rely on here. And the people came to her not just to settle disputes, but they also came to receive divine counsel and insight. She was a spiritual advisor, a prophetess, and she had a good read on what God wanted them to do in the spiritual dark ages. Evidently, many of the problems, listen closely, evidently many of the problems she had to solve were related to the Canaanite oppression. They were stealing their food. They had no food. They were raping their daughters, plundering villages, taking the women, and giving sometimes 2 Israeli women to 1 Canaanite warrior. They were confiscating their weapons and tools. They were enticing the young men into idol worship. This thing was spiraling out of control. And the people, they don't know what to do. They don't know who to turn to. They're looking for a hero. In this case, a Shiro. And these problems she had to work through evidently were related to all of these things, because in verse 6, slide number 5, Deborah sent for Barak, which means lightning or lights, son of Abinoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali, close to Hatzor, ironically, and said to him, listen to me, Barak, listen to me. The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to the Mount Tabor. I'm calling and commissioning you to go. This has to stop. Too many families are falling apart. You've got to do something, Barak. It's your time. It's time to go. Engage in the fight, man. Too much is at stake. So she's calling him. You know, it's interesting. I have been to Mount Tabor, and it's about a 13,000 foot conical mountain. It just juts up. It's kind of flat land around it and just juts up and mountains up. In fact, if you'll go to slide number 31, you're going to see this Slide number 31. I'm standing over at Megiddo. I'm looking across the Jezreel Valley, and you're looking at some flooding there. And that's the Mount Tabor. Go to the next slide, 32. There's Mount Tabor. See how that thing juts up? Deborah says, I'm calling you, Barak, to assemble a group of 10,000 men. I want you to go meet and rally up on that top of that mountain. That's where I want you to go. Okay? And if you go to the next slide, slide 33, you can see that there's a lot of switchbacks to get on top of that thing. But it's a very impressive, like I said, conical shaped mountain. This is where Barak is being called by Deborah the honeybee to go rally your troops, buddy, because we have got to do something about our women getting raped and our food getting confiscated and our people being oppressed by the Canaanites. Right? So Barak traveled a dangerous 5-mile journey to reach Deborah. And when they met, she told them that the Lord had commanded him to lead the people into battle. Look at verse 7. And God is speaking here through Deborah. God, Yahweh, will lead Sisera. Wait a second, that's the enemy. God leads the enemy? He sure does. He's sovereign, you see. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, king of the Canaanites, the oppressive Canaanites, with his chariot and his troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands. Yahweh himself says these words according to Deborah the judge, the Shiro of cycle 4. Deborah gave a word from God. I'm glad for Deborah again. Without Deborah, where would they be? But Barak's response was representative of the men of his time. Verse 8, Barak said to her, if you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. And I'm thinking, man up. Sounds familiar. I'll go to church if you'll go with me. I'll lead a family time if you'll do the praying. I don't know if I can do that. I'll go have that difficult conversation if you'll go with me. I'll apologize, confront, surrender, share, what have you, only if you go with me. It's a commentary on our times. Men will not lead. Barak says the only way I'm going to go, Deborah, is if you go too. Deborah's kind. Verse 9. Certainly, she says, I will go with you, said Deborah. But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. Now what Deborah says here is prophetic. A woman does do the job, but it's not Deborah. That's the irony. Stay tuned. She prophesies that a woman will in fact do the job and will be another Shiro that God uses, ironically enough. And Barak, we're going to need you to do the job of leading the men into battle. But I want you to know you're not going to get the glory and honor maybe you would have thought you would have gotten, because you're not manning up here. Verse 10, slide number 6. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. And I think heroes are ready. They just need leadership. And it will take a lot of teamwork to get us through the spiritual dark ages. We cannot do it alone. A hero needs other heroes rallying around them to get the job done. Okay, verse 11. Hurrying on. Now this is a new character being introduced. So pay attention here, and we'll give a fuller explanation when we get to verse 17 of Judges 4, because he's just introduced here, and he plays into the story a little later, and you're going to see how this works out. I love it. It's this great dramatic narrative. It's an incredible story. You need to stay with it, though. Okay, verse 11. Now Heber, A new character is being introduced, okay? His name means ally. Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Zaananim near Kadesh. You got to love these words, okay? But you have no idea of this verse, the significance of this verse or this guy. At this point, it's like we're in the story, and now the writer just drops him in. It's like, well, who is that? Who is Heber? And just know that the Kenites are a nomadic tribe. They kept to themselves. They stay clear of political hot spots. They were typically pro-Hebrew or pro-Israeli. But Heber breaks ranks and he sides with the Canaanites. And when he pulled up stakes and he moved north, we see this in Judges 1. They lived in the south in the area of the tribe of Judah. He had no idea that he was positioning a Shiro. He moved north toward Hatzor so he could be in conjunction with Jabin and Sisera, the Canaanite leaders. So he was turning in his allegiance. Okay? And when they, verse 12, when they, Heber the Kenite and others, told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. So Barak was preparing for battle. He's doing what Deborah, the honeybee Deborah, has told him to do. And he's assembling the men on top of Mount Tabor, this conical mountain in the middle of a valley where a war was going to break out. And he is watching this movement, and Heber decides he's going to report to the Canaanite leaders the movements of this Israeli army. So he's a spy. So you've got more intrigue and espionage in the story. He's a spy. Verse 12. Verse 13. Sisera summoned from Harosheth Hagoim to the Kishon River all of his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. Everybody shows up, and he doesn't know it, but God is bringing all of them. He's working behind the scenes. Yes, go get them. Go get them. God is working behind the scenes in the movements and stratagems of these military leaders, these oppressors of his people. And he brings all of them right where he wants them, right at the right moment. God can do that. He's God. And we think we're making our plans, and we think we've got our stratagems. God's working behind the scenes. Slide number 7. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go!" Exclamation point. What do you mean? Well, we're here on the mountain. We're ready. We've got the men assembled. We've given them weapons as much as we can find weapons. Hardly any available these days. But we've got our weapons. We're ready. And Deborah is there with them, and she's interceding, no doubt. She's praying. She's looking it over. She's trying to sense the Lord's timing. And eventually the timing of the Lord was right. And she says, "Go. Get involved, Barak. This is your moment. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. Go back to my Mount Tabor picture. Picture 10,000 guys on top of this thing. Next one, please. 10,000 guys on top of this thing with whatever weapons they can find. And they come rushing off of this thing at full tilt. Coming off of this mountain into the valley where the chariots are waiting. The chariots like it down in the valley, right? It's flatter there. They can maneuver better there, have better shots there, right? That's where they're hanging out, waiting for these guys to come off the mountain. And Deborah says she sees something in the distance. You'll see what in just a moment. And she says, "Go, this is the time." And 10,000 Israelis come screaming off of this mountain under the authority of prophetess Deborah the prophetess, the honeybee. She says, "God's going before you. You have nothing to fear. I don't care what spies are working against you in the person of a Heber." She just says, it's time for you to go. Go. And boy, they took off. Judges chapter 5 verse 4 gives us insight as to what was happening. We don't see it here in Judges 4, but Judges 5 verse 4 we see it. Go to slide 11. What did she see? Well, we see that when you, Lord, went from Seir, when you marched from the land of Edom, the earth shook, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water. What did she see? She saw a thunderstorm in the distance, and she said, God is at work. She saw it. Slide number 27. Go to slide 27. She talks about Edom. Look at Edom. It's the very bottom of your map. That's where this storm started, and it began to move. Deborah's on top of the mountain praying. She says, God, we're here. We're obedient. We're ready. Our men are in alignment. We're ready to deliver the people from oppression. Here we are on Mount Tabor. What do you want us to do? What's our next move? God says, just hold on. I got it on the way. A storm begins to develop in Edom. Seir, the text says. Edom. It moves northwest. And eventually it comes to settle. I love this. It comes to settle right where they are gathered at Mount Tabor. God was at work in the storm. And what we're looking at here is that this conflict takes place in the dry season, evidently, because Sisera, a military general, would have never placed his chariots in a field of battle where the mud was going to be so great and the water just inundating the air with water and flooding it. He would have never placed them in that position if they were in any kind of immediate danger. So it's the dry season. And God brings about this incredible storm. And He fills the valley with water. And He brought the iron chariots to a standstill. And this evened things up considerably. And the Israelis cleaned their clock in the battle. The Canaanites had rain and possibly even hail hitting them in the face, coming off of this steep mountain under the fog that had evidently descended down on top of this mountain. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, these 10,000 guys come off of this mountain into the muddy plains. It was a perfect plan. God had it timed just right. Deborah called it, and He used Deborah and Barak to get everyone in place, and He used Heber the spy to get the enemy in place and to position the enemy forces, and God said, go. Now's your time. Now's your day. And there's an application right there. First Sunday of the new year, it's go time. All the little clouds of your life, your family stuff, your personal stuff, your government, your nation, all aspects of society, a cloud has gathered. And God says, now's the time to make a move, church. Now's the time to make your move. It's go time. It's time for the men to lead. It's time for the women to be in touch with God, inspiring the men to lead. It's go time. Verse 15. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all of his chariots and army by the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. What's going on? The chariot's stuck in the mud. And since Sisera wouldn't have taken his chariots into the field had he suspected any kind of bad weather, we can assume that this battle was probably fought during June to September dry season, which is typical in Israel. And when you remember, now listen to me, when you remember that the Canaanite god Baal was the god of storms, you can see how the sudden change of weather could have affected the superstitious Canaanites. I mean, they served the god of Baal. And why in the world is Baal helping their enemies? And so they get disconcerted. They lose confidence. It's like, wait a second, what is going on? The god of the storms is assisting our enemies. Maybe He's turned His back on us. Maybe He's abandoned me. Routed means confused or thrown into panic, as we look at the Hebrew definition. They were in mud. Picture this. They're in mud. They have chariots, yes. They've got arrow archers, yes. They've got chariots armored with iron, yes. They have foot soldiers, probably as many as 10,000 or more, like the Israelites. We're not told how many, but we know that they had all of their forces amassed in this valley. but they can't see. It's raining so hard, perhaps hailing, that it's coming down in their faces. They can't see to shoot. They're cold. They're wet. They're being slaughtered. Their God is turned against them. They're panicked. They're routed. They're totally in disarray. See, that's what a sovereign God can do when you set yourself up against His people and against His causes and against His purposes. Barak, verse 16, pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim. And that is, he chased them all the way back to the military fortress from which they had come. All the way west, to the west of the Esdraelon Valley, all the way west from the fighting theater where the fighting broke out there at the base of Mount Tabor. And all of Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Slide 28 will show you. On slide 28, you're going to see kind of some arrows guiding you around the battle. Again, Harosheth Hagoyim to the east, to the west. They came and fought at Mount Tabor. They chased them all the way back, probably 10 to 15 miles, all the way back to the military encampment from which they had come. And all of them were wiped out, at least all of them except for one officer, military leader. And guess who his name was? Slide 17. One guy still surviving. His name was Sisera. Verse 17, slide 7. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot. He went east to the tent of Yael. And her name means wild mountain goat. Now, how would you like to nickname your bride? Hey, wild mountain goat. Okay? Now, I can see some problems right there. And so please, on this first Sunday of the new year, don't go home and call your wife a wild mountain goat. You'll get away with honeybee a lot easier than wild mountain goat. This was what her name meant. She's got some raccoon in her bone. You ever met a woman with some raccoon in her bone? She's got some starch and substance, and she was known as a wild mountain woman. Her name is Yael. The wife, get this, of Heber, the spy, who's in cahoots with the Canaanite alliance, King Jabin and Sisera. He knows these guys personally. And he's in alignment. In fact, his tribe, the Kenites, got in alignment with the Canaanites, and now they're working together to defeat the Lord's people and to annihilate them and to oppress them and to take control of a promised land aforetime given to them by the promises of God. And Heber the Kenite, because this is who her husband was, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hatzor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. Sisera thought, well, this is a place maybe I could go and find a place to get something to eat or drink and to get rested up and to be hidden for a while to escape these crazy Israelites who's totally routed us in the battle. And of course, we see that the Kenites had relationship. They had married into Moses' family, so they were distant relatives of Moses, and Sisera has no idea. In fact, Heber was loyal to the Canaanites, but as you're going to see in the story, that didn't mean his wife was loyal to the Canaanites. Yael had another alliance in her life. I'm not going to say she was a Yahweh worshiper, but I'm going to say that she knew where her allegiances really were, and she sensed what she needed to do. And in fact, she ends up fulfilling the prophecy of Deborah that a woman would get the glory for the battle. And that's exactly what happens. He had no idea of these deeper ties. Verse 18, Yael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord." She recognizes who he is. She gives him a term of respect. And "Come right in," she says. She's very friendly. "Don't be afraid." Evidently, she could read fear on his face. And so he entered her tent. And that should raise up eyebrows right there, especially in this culture and time. He enters her tent and she covered him with a blanket. He's muddy. He's wet. He's tired. He's exhausted from the chase. It was about a 6-mile run that he had to run from the place of the battle to the place where she was located in her tent. So he's run for 6 miles. I think sometimes I run maybe 100 yards. And I'm like, oh, this is crazy. Why do I do this to myself here at the new year and all that? But I'm going to do my best. Okay, some of you runners are just shaking your heads. But this guy ran for 6 miles. Yael saw this. She doesn't know what's happening in the battle. No doubt she knows that a battle is taking place. But she doesn't know the outcome of the battle, and she's doing her household chores. And by the way, if you ever doubt that homemakers are important in the revolution, if you ever doubt that mothers are important in the revolution, if you ever doubt that in the spiritual dark ages you've got to have, if you think that you have to have some great position to be powerful and impactful in the spiritual dark ages, think again, because if men won't rise up to lead, God says, I'll use homemakers to do the job. I'll do mothers to do the job men should be doing. I'll use mothers if I have to. Not if I have to, it's that I get to. Because they're the shapers of heroes to come. Don't ever doubt it. What God is doing here in Judges. He'll use military guys. He'll use handicapped guys with a vision for deliverance and freedom. He'll use farmers who just have an ox goad, and He'll use a homemaker with nothing but a hammer and a tent peg. In the times of the dark ages. You see, when we look at all the details, how Heber moved her to the north, he puts her right in a spot where Yael can do what she's going to do. We're going to read about in a moment. He thought he was doing the right thing by the Canaanites. God says, oh, He's sovereign. God says, thank you, Heber. I needed her right there. I needed my Shira right there. I think sometimes when we make moves and we start new jobs and we meet strange people and we come across helpful insights while searching for other things, sometimes we pocket dial people. Does your phone pocket dial people? Oh, geez. It's like, God, why have people heard? But sometimes your phone pocket dials. You think, well, what? Sometimes God works even in those. In fact, if you pocket dial somebody, just say, I love you. God told me to tell you. Hang up. That's a message from God, okay? God's in it. God's in the details here. You just look at this and you're just like, there's no way that you can conclude. I mean, God had them on a mountain when the storm was coming. He had them ready to go. He got the enemy to show up just at the right time. He uses the spies' work against him. I mean, God is sovereign, friends. He's in the details of this. And Yael, she goes out to meet Sisera, this mighty Canaanite military general who's exhausted from the battle. And she covers him up, invites him into her tent, covers him up, and gives him a blanket. And before he falls to sleep, verse 19, and by the way, anytime you have a man lying in a woman's tent, usually there's something else on his mind when he does revive. But he says before he goes to sleep, verse 19, I'm thirsty, he said. Please give me some water, Yael. And she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink, a milkshake, and covered him up. Now, again, Yael knew nothing about the status of the battle. She probably knew of the battle, but she didn't know what had happened in the battle. And she sees Sisera coming, and he's a Canaanite military guy. He shows up, and he asked for water. She gave him milk. He's on the run. She gave him a place to hide. He's cold. She gave him a blanket. He feels abandoned. She provided a source of support. He needed shelter from the rain. She provided a warm, dry tent. I mean, it wasn't the Hilton, but it would do. Yael is over the top in her hospitality. All of this conveys that she will protect him. In fact, when he asked for water, he gave her milk. She gave him milk. And when you look at the usage of milk in the Bible, it has a sensuous quality to it. In fact, in the Song of Solomon, deep kissing is referenced as milk under the tongue of a woman, or wine under the tongue of a woman. I think Yael stepped into the situation. She said to Sisera, I'll give you what you need. I'll provide a place. I know you've been hard in the battle, a place of safety. I'll take care of you. Whatever your needs, Sisera, I'm here. I got you covered, dude. Come on in. Take a load off. Sleep in my bed. There, let me give you a blanket. When you wake up, wonderful delights. Well, what does this do to Sisera, the mighty military general? He falls asleep. But before he does, verse 20 says, slide 8, he says, Yael, sweetie, Yael, you little mountain goat, you little wild mountain goat. Woo! Man, I might have lost the battle, but woo! Baal has given me one last favor, right? Sweetie, would you stand in the doorway of the tent? He told her. If someone comes by and asks you, is anyone in there? Say no, because I am tired of running. I have no more strength to go on. He asked her to conceal him and to lie about it. And that was a huge tip-off and mistake for him to make. She knew immediately from that comment that the Canaanites were not winning in the battle, that in fact he was being chased. He shows up, a mighty military general. He's alone. He shows up. She knows that something's not right. And so again, she's blind to all that's happening, but this is happening in real time for her. And being a wise woman, she concluded that Sisera was fleeing the battlefield. He was by himself, and it meant that the Israelites had won the battle or were winning the battle. The Canaanite alliance was in trouble. It was breaking down. It was deteriorating. It was losing in the battle. And no doubt somebody's chasing Sisera. He was so exhausted. And friends, this is where the story takes a surprising turn. The top military leader, driven by the task of annihilating Israel, was sound asleep in her tent. She knew Moses. She had family connections with his clan. She knew God's plan for Israel. She knew that God was obviously calling her to turn the tide, that God was raising her up to be a shero in a time when men were too weak to lead. They might fight a battle, but too weak to lead. But the more she thought about it, standing in the doorway of the tent, and we don't know how long she's thought about it, she weighed it all out. She thought about her options and the potential repercussions. And if she protected Sisera, she'd be in trouble with the Israelites who would eventually come looking for him. If she assassinated him, Heber, her husband, would possibly have her executed because there was an alliance his family had with the Canaanites. She could receive a death sentence, or she could be praised as a shero, depending on how all this went. And now remember, Sisera is fighting for the Canaanites. He believes that Israel should be oppressed and eliminated. He believes that their women should be kidnapped and used for sexual play toys for the men of Canaan. And with all this in mind, and not really knowing the full ramifications of what was at stake here, perhaps, verse 21, but Yael, the wild mountain goat, Heber's wife, so that there's no mistake, the Canaanite spy's wife, Yael, she hammers the point home literally in narrative slow motion. She picked up a tent peg. It could have been wooden or metal, but either way it would have been sharp on the point. She picks up a tent peg and a hammer. These were common household items for tent dwellers. In fact, as I dug into this week, it was a Kenite woman's responsibility to pitch tents and take them down when it was time to move on. And so she would have been swift and accurate in her use of a tent peg. Yael, the wild mountain woman, goat woman, was tough and sturdy. And like I said, she had weathered a few storms, and she could survive in primitive conditions. She had some raccoon in her bone. And she thinks about this and not really knowing the full ramifications of all of it. She takes what she knows. She takes a tent peg and a hammer, and she goes quietly to him while he lays fast asleep there in her tent, exhausted. Now prepare yourself. And I'm not necessarily saying this is your theme verse for 2013, but I'm just telling you, it gets pretty powerful here. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. The temple is that soft indented spot on the side of your head that, your mom told you if you ever got hit there, you would probably die. Just then, verse 22, Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera. We don't know how much time elapsed. Slide 9. And Yael went out to meet him. Come, she said, I will show you the man you're looking for. So he went with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. And for a captain to flee from a battle was embarrassing. For him to be killed while fleeing was humiliating. And to be killed by a woman was the most disgraceful thing of all. It added insult to injury. And what you find in our story, what you find in our story, if you look at the men in our story, you find a man laying disgracefully at the feet of a woman, and you find another man who was hesitant to fight in the battle unless a woman would go with him. What you find in our story is a time when people would do what's right in their own eyes. It's a time when men will refuse to lead. And they are a slave to their appetites and passions. And that takes them right out of the game. I'll read a few concluding verses next week because I'm out of time here this morning. Man, that went quick. Out of time here this morning, but just let me say something as we look by way of application at the story. That the men in our story provide a commentary on our times. The women do, and perhaps I'll deal with that next week. But the men especially do. And the dark ages get darker when men won't lead. And that's why I issue a call to the men of our congregation. That unless you lead, the dark ages are going to get darker. And unless we pick ourselves up and realize that we have to be watchful in the dark ages, because there's a lot of little trickery things out there the enemy uses to take you out of the game. Just like Sisera was duped by the trickery of Yael. She used hospitality to trick him, and thus he lays dead at her feet. There's a lot of trickery that's being used today by the enemy to take men out of the game. And, you had Barak, whose hand had to be held by a woman. You have Sisera, who lies helplessly childlike at the feet of a woman. And I see these two men as models for what's happening in our day. And here it is. I finally made the connection. I need to wrap this up. So listen as I try to wrap it with this application. Dr. Philip Zimbardo of Stanford University and psychologist Nikita Duncan, they argue in a book, The Demise of Guys, Why Boys Are Struggling and What We Can Do About It. And you know what they're seeing? In the lives of young boys, they are becoming addicted to video games and online pornography on a scale unparalleled by any addiction that we've seen in history. It's unbelievable what's happening in the lives of young boys, according to this research. And as a result, the boys are like Barak. I'll go if you go with me. Courage is faltering. And as a result, boys lie slain at the feet of pornography. They cannot rise to lead. There is no moral authority to lead with. They are spent on their pleasures. In fact, video warfare promises adrenaline without danger. That's why digital soldiering is such a hot item. A boy feels brave, he feels adventuresome, he feels courageous when he fights in a video format. But put him in a real battle, he becomes like Barak in a hurry. Because there's no real courage, virtue that's built up in his life as a hero. In fact, say these authors, young men who play video games and use porn the most are being digitally rewired in a totally new way that demands constant stimulation. Not only does this kind of addiction rob guys of time, money, and health, it diminishes their ability to enjoy real life, which can never offer stimulation as frequently or as easily or as much variety as they have available to them today. Young men addicted to digital sex. Young men addicted to digital soldiering. They're unable to be heroic. They're unable to engage in these acts for real because they're growing up with new brains. They're being rewired. And they're poorly wired for traditional learning. And they lack the capacity for strong romantic relationships because they've always been a junkie on this adrenaline rushes without the commitment of a true battle. The drive for stimulation is something that it supplants true courage and true heroism. And the sensation of being a real lover, a real fighter, escapes them because they have learned to rewire their brains to do this kind of thing in the virtual world of their minds, or the fantasy world. And I just want to say to our young boys, our young men, that if we have any hope for a better tomorrow in the dark ages, this is where the battle has to be fought and won, or we'll have nothing else left to give. We will lie at the feet helplessly of someone who says it's time for you to go. Now listen, Sisera, it was a time for him to go. It was a time for him to go. It was a time for the oppression to be broken. But what I'm saying is, Sisera was driven by this sensual hospitality of a woman who was telling him everything he wanted to hear. And that became his whole life. And he got caught up in that. And Barak was caught in a time when men would not lead. And he refused to be a part of the battle unless a woman would go with him. Listen, women, I'll address some of the issues related to this story with you next week. But I'm going to tell you right now, I thank God for women who lead. I thank God for women who love when the leadership is not there in a family. When the women rise up and say, you know what, we got to do something, or this thing we're not going to make it. Our family's not going to make it. And you've risen up and you've led in those situations. I praise God for that, because like a Deborah, like a Yael, you've stepped up. No, I'm not saying that you've assassinated people. In fact, don't go do that. We're not in the same kind of governmental situation they were in. But what I'm saying is, you have led in a very dark time. And without your leadership, who knows where it would be. So I thank you for leading. I want to tell you about another guy as we wrap. When Jesus came, he came with a single commitment. He would not stake people to the ground for their moral failures and their rebel ways. He himself would be staked to a tree on our behalf. And the scales of justice and rebellion, love and pardon, they were balanced in and through him, friends. And we were all on the run like Sisera. We were so exhausted from the battles of life like Barak. We were so confused about what to live for and who to fight for. We have caved into our lust, our passions. We lived only for self-gratification, for digital soldiering, for online pixel fixes. We had served so many idols and self-destructed in the process, and all of our gods had let us down like the Baal gods there in the valley of Esdraelon. Our lives were so messed up. We're fighting, we're stealing, we're lying, we're suing, we're sneaking, we're getting even, we're living for the now. All of us have played the harlot. We've bedded down our lovers. And even though God had promised that a Messiah would come, at times it looked pretty bleak in the nation of Israel's life. But eventually he came. The Messiah came. And instead of annihilating all of us, he lay down on a wooden stake. And instead of taking a hammer and a nail and staking us to the moral tree of failure, he laid down himself. And a Roman soldier took a hammer and a stake and they nailed him to a cross. And by that action, he said, "This is for you." There's a God who cares about you this morning. There's a God who's sovereign. He works in the details of life more than you'll ever know. And there's a God who's spoken to our world in the presence of Jesus, who was staked to the ground for you, for me. I think of no better way than to start 2013 than saying, Lord, I realize some of the stuff Joey talked about this morning, it hits me right where I need to be hit. And if I have any hope of getting out of the dark ages in my life personally, it's going to be because I've turned my life over to the Lord. Why don't you do that on the first Sunday here in 2013? It's been a huge passage. You've been patient. Allowed me the time to try to see it to completion. Next week, I'll deal with the music that follows this incredible story. Will you pray with me? Thank you, God, for this morning. We come to you confessing that we see some stuff here in the story that kind of disturbs us, moves us, humbles us. It takes us to a place of desperation. Because not only is our world in a spiritual dark age, our personal lives can live there too. And so many of us men lie just lie helplessly at the feet of a God that of lust, of our own gratifications. It has slayed men and taken them out of the battle. And I ask and pray that you would redeem, save, deliver, and raise up our men. Because it's not going to get better until the men rise up and lead. And then I pray for homemakers and mothers who thought that they really aren't heroic. Homemakers and mothers like Deborah, who was also a professional, but she was a mother first. I think of people like Yael, who was just doing her homemaker duties. And God basically laid down something in front of her and said, this is what I want you to do. These homemakers don't realize how powerful it is when they tend to the home and they make the home an inviting environment for heroes, little young heroes to rise up and prepare and be prepared to lead eventually in life. And so I pray you would raise up these moms and homemakers, these wives, these females in our congregation who hold this thing together, who volunteer so faithfully, who come to church even if their husbands won't come with them. They come to church and they're leading and they're helping as best they can in a dark time. God, give them the strength, give them the courage to rise up and lead and to be a hero in our generation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you. Would you stand with me this morning? Part 2 next week. Come be a part of it.